World leaders at the Munich Security Conference have laid out opposing visions of the health of the Western alliance. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo rejected claims that America is backing away from its global role as a democratic ally. Pompeo told the audience that, quote, "The West is winning and we're winning together." Germany's president said yesterday, however, the U.S. was pushing its own national interests over international cooperation. And French President Emmanuel Macron has also given his views. Here's what he had to say.
The Europe I have in mind is a Europe that is sovereign, united and democratic and acts as such. And in 10 years' time, I'd like to see a Europe that has enough leverage to act, to be sovereign when it comes to policies, to technology, migration, defense, feeding the world, and also in terms of climate protection, environmental protection, and a Europe which has relations with its neighbors, Russia and Africa and the Middle East.
And for more on this, let's go straight to DW's chief political editor, Michaela Kufner, who is in Munich at the Security Conference. Michaela, Macron says the West is weakening. What crisis does he see Europe facing?
Well, the West as a whole, he says, is weakening, and that, of course, also means the transatlantic relations. In fact, I think Mike Pompeo is pretty much the only one you would get the quote here from that the West is winning internationally with this whole host of challenges, namely from a rise in China. It was notable there that Emmanuel Macron didn't hold a speech. He wanted a sit-down conversation and taking questions only. This comes after he held a speech just a couple of days ago where he extended an invitation to European partners to partake in France's nuclear capabilities. That would be a game changer, really a major shift in the outlook on European defense if countries wanted to engage with France on that more. So this is what the US was facing coming here, really not mentioning that terribly much, but here a French president eager to flesh out what he means in concrete terms by more European sovereignty, a democracy with its values also able to defend them, not just in terms of defense, but also in terms of how a society is built. In these days of friction between the US and Europe, you don't really find a European leader very often who fleshes out what those differences are. And he said that Europe has a fundamentally different system also in terms of social security, and that is something that the Europeans need to define more for themselves, stand for themselves more in the world, but trying to create as little distance as possible to the US, because he wants to stick with NATO and he wants to keep the Americans on board, although, as he says, things aren't as they used to be.
Well, speaking of the Americans, and you were mentioning Mike Pompeo saying the West is winning, let's have a little listen to what the U.S. Secretary of State had to say about the transatlantic alliance.
I'm happy to report that the death of the transatlantic alliance is grossly over-exaggerated. The West is winning. We are collectively winning. We're doing it together.
That definitely sounds like a difference of opinion to me, Michaela. If there is a split, how would you describe it? What is it over?
Well, I'd even say that there's a split between what Mike Pompeo said and Mark Esper, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, who followed afterwards, because what he did is flesh out the major challenge posed to the West, to Western liberal democracy, namely by China, particularly by China. So that doesn't really underline or do anything to help the argument that the West as a whole is winning. Talking to many experts here, and the title of this conference is, after all, Westlessness, a lack of leadership, the withdrawal of the United States from the Middle East, also seen as something that's created more room for maneuver, particularly also for Russia to come in there and decide what's happening on the ground in Syria. So these are all aspects that don't really fundamentally help that particular argument. I think where there are major differences is the outlook on how to take this forward. The US has always called for more spending on the side of the European partners. They are doing that to a certain degree. That's what the latest International Institute for Strategic Studies figures show, 4% rise in international defense spending, but also particularly European defense spending, so that will be seen very positively by the United States. But there is underlying friction, I'd say, also how to deal with Russia and with China. And here we heard from Emmanuel Macron that although there are many values not shared with Russia at all, that there is a need to cooperate with Russia, and he actually sees it as a failure of the West that Russia was able to gain so much influence in Syria after the Europeans and the US didn't act very resolutely there.
We also heard this morning, and I think importantly, from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. I'd like us just to have a quick listen to what he had to say and hear your reaction.
Some say the answer is more Europe. And I agree. But this is only part of it. Because more Europe cannot mean Europe alone. Any attempt to distance Europe from North America not only weakens the transatlantic bond and our ability to compete on the global stage, it also risks dividing Europe. I don't believe in Europe alone, as I don't believe in America alone. I believe in Europe and America together.
Michaela, is Jens Stoltenberg being realistic? Aren't there a number of European countries that are actually more seriously thinking about going it alone than ever before?
Well, we've seen criticism from the US over NATO. We've heard French President Emmanuel Macron call NATO brain dead. So at the very least, there is a desperate need for reform within NATO. There's a recognition of that, but it's unclear what will really take them forward. At the same time, I do have to stress that that is simply Jens Stoltenberg's job. He is the diplomat-in-chief keeping NATO together. So he would say that, what he just said.
Okay, Michaela Kushner at the Munich Security Conference. Thanks for that.